In the heart of West Africa, a quiet revolution is underway, one not of arms but of brooms, boots, and bold resolve. On 18th of June 2023, the government of Burkina Faso launched something unheard of in the region. A semi-civil, semi-military force charged not with guarding borders, but with cleaning streets, correcting habits, and restoring pride. Amid the dust and disarray of its capital Ouagadougou, a new brigade began marching, not to battle foreign foes, but to fight an enemy far more insidious: disorder. Once crippled by clogged gutters, scattered livestock, and traffic paralyzed by makeshift markets, the city had become a symbol of a nation unraveling. But under the young and resolute leadership of President Ibrahim Traoré, a new message resounded across the boulevards. Nothing great can be built without order and discipline. This is not just about trash or traffic, it's a spiritual awakening in the heart of Africa. Don't scroll. Subscribe, stand with us, and let the African civic revolution be heard across the oceans. Before Brigade Labal came into existence, life in many parts of Burkina Faso, particularly the capital city Ouagadougou, was a portrait of quiet decline. Households kept goats and cattle in cramped courtyards. Wastewater trickled freely onto broken pavements. Trash piled high, clogging ditches and inviting clouds of mosquitoes to breed. In neighborhoods like Hamdallah and Amdal, the streets were no longer arteries of movement, but arteries of decay. Illnesses like malaria and dengue fever surged with every rainy season, while public complaints were met with silence or bureaucratic shrugs. The roads told another story, one of slow suffocation. Pavements vanished beneath roadside stalls, traffic sputtered through mazes of parked cars, and vendors claimed entire lanes as private shops. What began as survival turned to chaos, and amid it all, one question lingered. Was this still a state in control? Following the coup in September 2022, in which Ibrahim Traoré assumed transitional power, the administration inherited a nation grappling with fear, frustration, and a crisis of legitimacy. The young president understood something profound. Political authority is not just written in law. It is earned in everyday life. So he issued a vision. No greatness without order. No progress without discipline. And out of that declaration came a force unlike any other, Brigade Labal. Launched officially on 18th June 2023, Labal was more than an enforcement unit. It was a civil social task force, conceived to restore not just cleanliness, but pride and patriotism. Its mandate was triple-edged: enforce, educate, and mobilize. Unlike traditional police or military squads, Labal was designed to coexist with communities rather than dominate them. Dressed in uniforms that symbolized state presence, yet trained in communication and civic engagement, its members were deployed across the capital and beyond. Their mission? To tackle long-standing social ills head-on: livestock in urban spaces, indiscriminate waste disposal, illegal parking and public obstruction, and to do so not with brute force, but with persuasive dialogue and public participation. Strategically, Labal addressed the twofold challenge faced by the administration. First, to improve the physical reality of daily life. Second, to reclaim moral and institutional credibility in the eyes of citizens. Every Labal patrol was both a symbolic gesture and a practical intervention. Their presence reminded people that the state had not disappeared. It had returned with purpose. Early operations began in densely populated wards where problems were most visible. Within weeks, gutters were unclogged, animals relocated, and pedestrian walkways cleared. But more than that, something intangible began to shift. The tone of neighborhoods changed. Residents who once ignored government announcements started opening their doors and joining cleanup drives. Children watched, elders advised, and youth volunteered. This was no accident. Labal's approach was rooted in respect. Its officers were trained not to impose, but to inspire. When encountering violations, they would explain first, warn second, and act last. The objective was transformation, not punishment. To many outside observers, it seemed inconceivable that such a force could thrive in a post-coup environment rife with skepticism. Yet Labal's real power lay in its simplicity. It answered the ordinary citizen's most urgent plea: not for ideology, but for dignity. A clean street, a safe walkway, a sense of order that made one proud to call a place home. The government, too, understood that this visible transformation had to be coupled with strategic messaging. Media campaigns, radio interviews, and neighborhood meetings were coordinated to share success stories and encourage replication. Brigade Labal was no longer just a state instrument. It was becoming a community identity. But what happened when Labal boots hit the ground and the rules suddenly changed? When the first Labal squads began their rounds through the congested alleys of Ouagadougou, many residents watched with folded arms and skeptical hearts. After all, they had seen state agents come and go, often with grand speeches, little follow-through, and sometimes harsh hands. But this time something felt different. Unlike police raids of the past, Labal didn't arrive to intimidate. They arrived to explain. Their first act wasn't to issue fines or confiscate goods. It was to talk. To the woman selling cassava on the corner, the young man using his stall to block a waterway, the family raising goats in a back alley. They asked questions. They listened. And then they taught. The message was always the same. Your health matters. Your city deserves better. And it starts with you. At first, some resisted. Change, especially when imposed from above, often feels like insult. But Labal's persistence was quiet and steady. They returned, not to punish, but to remind. When warnings turned to gentle actions, moving animals, clearing rubbish, people began to understand this was not a crackdown. It was a campaign for dignity, and dignity, once awakened, is contagious. Within weeks, neighborhood associations began organizing their own cleanup days. Mosques and churches offered meeting spaces for Labal outreach sessions. School children brought home pamphlets on public hygiene and civic duty. Elders who once grumbled now praised. If Labal didn't exist, one elderly man told a radio reporter, we'd have to invent them. In Amdal district, a group of street vendors voluntarily relocated their stalls to a designated area. In Hamdalai, families formed drainage brigades working with Labal officers to dig channels before the rains. In countless courtyards, livestock disappeared, not because of fear, but because people understood the risk. The emotional turning point came not from a decree, but from a shift in identity. Citizens began to see cleanliness as patriotism and order as honor. This was the true triumph of Labal, not the number of fines issued, but the number of hearts won. And in the background, a silent giant stirred, public trust. As Labal operations expanded, President Traoré's image became closely tied to their success. Posters of his clean-shaven face next to a gleaming street corner began appearing across the city. He was no longer just a leader who seized power. He was the man who restored order to the people's doorsteps. For many, it was the first time a government initiative felt not distant, but personal. Not abstract, but practical. Media coverage amplified this momentum. Stories of citizens cooperating, districts transformed, and families empowered became daily headlines. And in a country so recently fractured by political upheaval, this new narrative of participation and purpose offered something rare: hope. But perhaps the most powerful response came not in words, but in behavior. The woman who once swept trash to the street now walked an extra block to the bin. The young men who had viewed public spaces as profit zones now spoke of protecting the neighborhood. Labal was no longer a patrol. It was a mirror, reflecting what the people could be if given a voice and a vision. And as support for Traoré surged, what deeper transformation was quietly unfolding in the streets. With the dust settling and the streets slowly clearing, the impact of Brigade Labal began to crystallize not just in the physical environment, but in the psyche of the nation. In purely practical terms, the results were undeniable. Areas once inundated with garbage now saw flowing drains. Stagnant water, once breeding grounds for mosquitoes, had receded. Hospitals in districts like Hamdalai reported noticeable drops in malaria cases. Public health workers observed fewer outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases. Traffic, too, began to move again, slowly but surely. With sidewalks cleared and vendors redirected, pedestrians regained their space and vehicles flowed more freely. For many citizens, it was the first time in years that walking through the market didn't feel like navigating a minefield. But the greatest transformation lay beneath the surface, in the way people thought about responsibility. Cleanliness was no longer seen as a municipal obligation. It became a collective mission. Neighbors who once turned a blind eye to each other's dumping habits now spoke up. Community WhatsApp groups buzzed not just with gossip, but with notices. Clean up Saturday. Everyone bring a broom. School children sang songs about hygiene and order, composed by local artists and broadcast on national radio. This was, in many ways, the rebirth of a civic identity. The administration of President Ibrahim Traoré seized this moment of momentum to reinforce a key message. Discipline was not punishment. It was love of country. And the response was tangible. Local businesses donated gloves and equipment. Religious leaders preached cleanliness as godliness. Street murals began to appear, featuring quotes like, "Order is power," and "Our streets, our pride." Politically, this marked a turning point. After a coup that left Burkina Faso suspended from international bodies and questioned at home, the government had finally delivered something real, something that touched daily life. While many in the West focused on defense and foreign alignment, citizens on the ground saw Labal as proof that the state could listen, act, and empower. Public confidence in the administration grew, particularly among older citizens who had witnessed decades of empty reforms. Some called it the first time since independence that the government actually walked the talk. For the youth, it became a point of pride, proof that they too could build a better nation. And it was this emotional ownership that signaled Labal's most profound success. The force had transitioned from a government initiative to a social compact, an agreement, unwritten yet deeply felt, that rebuilding Burkina Faso was a shared duty. Of course, challenges remained. Not all neighborhoods responded equally. Corruption lingered in pockets. Some citizens still resisted change, but the momentum was unmistakable, and the symbolic weight of that progress was enormous. For many watching from afar, Labal's impact seemed modest, just cleaner streets and fewer cows on sidewalks. But for those within, it was seismic, because order once broken is hard to restore, and once restored, it becomes sacred. Do you believe this is the kind of African civic revolution our ancestors dreamed of? Share your thoughts in the comments. But how is the world looking at this silent movement born in Burkina Faso? From the outside, the transformation in Burkina Faso stirred more curiosity than conversation. Western media, often fixated on security crises and foreign military alignments, barely whispered the name Brigade Labal. Yet, for those with a trained eye on Africa's grassroots, this movement was impossible to ignore. Governance specialists and urban planners in Africa and abroad began drawing quiet comparisons between Labal and community policing models seen in cities like Chicago, Lagos, and Rio de Janeiro. But while those efforts often relied on law enforcement recalibration, Labal was more civic than coercive, a structure designed not to police the people, but to reintroduce them to the power of their own order. From Geneva to Johannesburg, experts in public policy noted a rare alignment: macro-level political intention meeting micro-level community execution. And that was where the real innovation lay. For decades, international development strategies in Africa had been weighed down by top-heavy planning, donor dependency, and limited cultural resonance. Labal flipped that paradigm. Burkina Faso's initiative showed that reform didn't have to be imported. It could be homegrown, culturally rooted, and deeply participatory. This wasn't a United Nations blueprint or a Western NGO pilot. It was a national response to national challenges, owned by those it served. Within Pan-African circles, the brigade sparked debate. Could this model be replicated across the Sahel? Could civic order become a cornerstone of African sovereignty, not imposed through military drills, but lived through daily practice? Even in the United States, where urban decay and social fragmentation challenged dozens of communities, observers began asking, what if we had our own Labal, not in uniform, but in purpose? Meanwhile, the role of the United States in relation to this silent revolution remained minimal, focused largely on military cooperation and anti-terrorism frameworks. U.S. engagement with Burkina Faso had rarely addressed the cultural roots of instability, like civic erosion, urban decay, or public alienation. And yet, here was a movement doing just that. Some policy voices suggested that this was a missed opportunity, that if the U.S. truly wished to champion democracy in Africa, it could begin by supporting civic infrastructure, not just ballot boxes, but broomsticks and storm drains. The kind of support that empowers citizens not merely to vote, but to shape their own environments. In many ways, Labal posed a gentle challenge to the global order. What if the future of African governance lies not in high diplomacy, but in low streets? And what if this was not just about Burkina Faso, but about Africa redefining governance? The true measure of Brigade Labal lies not only in what it has already achieved, but in what it dares to imagine. If sustained, Labal has the potential to move beyond Ouagadougou, reaching the dusty fringes of rural provinces and the crowded lanes of secondary cities. Its model, one rooted in education, participation, and patriotism, could adapt to diverse local realities, weaving a common fabric of civic pride across the nation. But more than expansion, Labal's promise lies in integration. Plans are already in motion to link the force with schools, where children will learn not just reading and arithmetic, but responsibility and respect. Women's associations, often the silent backbone of social order, are being tapped to champion neighborhood efforts. Youth clubs are finding new relevance, not in rebellion but in rebuilding. This is where Labal reveals its radical subtlety. It does not wage war, it raises awareness. It does not shout, it demonstrates. And in doing so, it invites Africa to ask itself, must revolutions always be loud? Or can they rise quietly from street corners and kitchen tables? For countries across the continent grappling with post-colonial fragmentation, foreign influence, and eroding public trust, the African civic revolution embodied by Labal offers a different kind of roadmap, one that starts not with power, but with purpose. The question, of course, is sustainability. Can the government resist the temptation to militarize or politicize Labal? Can communities keep their momentum when the initial novelty fades? Will transparency and accountability remain guiding principles even as power and popularity grow? These are not minor challenges, but they are challenges worth facing. Because if Burkina Faso can anchor Labal in long-term vision, it may do more than clean its streets. It may restore belief. Belief that change is possible. That dignity does not have to wait for foreign aid. That patriotism can be practiced in everyday acts, not just in slogans. Labal, then, is not just a policy, it is a philosophy of possibility. And for a continent often defined by its crises, that possibility is profound. So is Labal just the beginning of a deeper call to reclaim Africa's destiny? From the cracked pavements of Ouagadougou to the hopeful faces of school children learning what it means to care for their community, the rise of Brigade Labal marks more than just a cleanup operation. It signifies the awakening of a civic spirit long buried beneath the dust of disillusionment. In a time when coups and chaos often define the headlines from Africa, this movement offers a different story, one of discipline over disorder, pride over passivity, and local ownership over foreign dependence. At its core stands President Ibrahim Traoré, not merely as a transitional leader, but as a symbol of what happens when governance becomes grounded in everyday dignity. Labal is still young, and its path will be tested. But its early success has proven that governments do not need to wait for international approval to meet the needs of their people. The power to transform is not found in foreign summits, but in the strength of citizens sweeping their own streets and believing, once again, that the nation belongs to them. This is the heartbeat of the African civic revolution. And while Brigade Labal began as a response to urban decay, it has grown into a national symbol, a quiet revolution declaring that Africa need not beg for solutions. It can build them from the ground up. If managed with care, transparency, and consistency, Labal could become not just Burkina Faso's pride, but a blueprint for a continent ready to redefine itself. Because when order is tied to identity and service to self-respect, even the most broken streets can give rise to greatness. What do you see in this quiet revolution? A flicker of hope? Or the spark of something far greater? If this story touched your spirit, don't just watch. Comment, "Africa can do it," and share this with someone who still believes in our continent's greatness. Subscribe, because the African civic revolution is already here.